Okay, so what I want to talk about today was the things we haven't seen with the Resident Evil 4 remake. Obviously, we've seen very little at the moment, and we do know some things about certain portions of the game through leaks and stuff like that. But in terms of the rest of the game, i.e. certain areas and certain enemies and stuff like that, we don't know much. So I kind of want to go over the things we haven't seen anything of, and talk about maybe how they'll change them, or what they'll do in the remake that's different from the original. So if there's anything from the original game you think will be changed drastically, do let me know. But without any further ado, let's just jump into it. So the first thing I want to talk about, which is probably the biggest point in the whole video, is the castle section of Resident Evil 4. Now if you've played Resident Evil 4 enough, you'll know that the castle, compared to the village and compared to the island, is quite a tone shift. It's very over the top in certain parts as well, and I'll get into that in a moment, but it's also a big part of the game. It's a big portion of the game. A lot happens in that castle section in terms of the story and the development of characters, and them changing it based around the kind of structure they want to work with the remake, with it being more grounded, more serious, could change a lot of what is involved in the castle section. A couple moments in the castle section to me that jump out the most that could probably be changed is the minecart section, where you go underneath. The lava room, or the fire room people call it, where you have to kind of like shoot the flaming dragon heads, the whole room's on fire, it's kind of ridiculous. And then the giant Salazar statue that chases you out of a room. It's very over the top, it's very action focused, and that's obviously not the tone they want to keep with the remake, so I can probably see those parts being changed, or even removed in certain ways. A lot of what is involved in RE4 as well, in those sections, there's a lot of QTEs, and I don't think they're going to stay in the remake. I really don't. QTEs were in a lot of games back then, like a lot of games, not just Resident Evil. They were very popular at the time, across any kind of game. And they're not really a thing now, not really. So I don't think they'll be involved in the remake at all. There could be a few. I would probably say out of all of the parts of the game to keep them in, probably leave them in the Krauser knife fight, because it's such an iconic part of the game. Keep it as it is, just redo the graphics, obviously. But I think for the most part, a lot of the QTE sections are probably going to be gone. Another thing about the castle section is the cultists. Now, they're quite spooky at first. You know, when you first see them, they're coming at you with scythes and shields and stuff like that, and they always chant at you. Hopefully that stays intact. Hopefully the chant's still there and they're still quite menacing. But again, there's certain parts in the castle section when you fight them, where they literally open up secret compartments in walls and have rocket launchers. One of them comes out the floor in a mounted turret, and again, it's very over the top. Like, it's very over the top. Those sequences are intense, that's for sure, especially on the harder difficulties, like on professional. But again, is that gonna fit the narrative and the structure of the story in the remake? Because again, it wants to be more scary, it wants to be more grounded, more serious, so I don't think they'll go to that level of extreme to keep the fights interesting. The way I see it is probably more enemies. You know, less of the RPG enemies, the mounted turret enemies, and more enemies coming at you with scythes and stuff like that. I think that would make up for it. In terms of what is in the castle that could stay, there's plenty of moments in the castle section that I really like, and they will probably fit the remake quite well. For example, you've got the maze with the dogs, which is just before you see Ada for the first time, properly at least. That's a pretty cool section. Could definitely be kind of redone in a more horror way, especially. You also got the blind guys, you know, the Wolverine guys. I actually forget what they're called, but essentially the ones where you have to shoot barrels to shoot them in the back to be able to kill them. They would also work really well in the remake. And then obviously you've got the Verdugo, is it Verdugo? The fight with the right hand man of Salazar, basically, like the monster thing. And then obviously the Salazar fight itself, which would probably still stay intact. But overall, you know, the castle section has plenty of parts in it where I think they would change it quite heavily. And then some parts where they should probably keep them in as they were because they work so well. But I do feel like out of all of the sections of the game, the castle will be the one that's changed the most, personally. Moving on from that, briefly, we have Ada Wong. Ada Wong is in the trailer, very briefly. From the looks of it, she's in the castle, so, you know, maybe she's more involved in the remake than she was in the original. There are theories going around that the Separate Ways DLC that's in 4 at the moment will be more integrated into the main game, and throughout the game you'll switch between the two. That's not confirmed, but it would be pretty cool to see. I do think there'll be a playable section as her, much like Resident Evil 2 Remake, where you play as her for a brief period. It makes sense to do that, and I'd imagine they'll probably do the same with Ashley as well, because Ashley, again, is playable in the original 4, so it would make sense that she's still playable in the remake. But in terms of Ada, we're not too sure, if she's going to be playable and how more involved she's going to be in the story. I would say separate ways will be there regardless, whether they put it into the main game and kind of work it in, or if it is just an extra campaign you get for finishing the game. I think it will be there still, anyway. Next up we have the Krauser section of the game, where you kind of fight him. That is an interesting section. I do think that will kind of remain intact, but one thing people are thinking about is, if you play Resident Evil 4 enough and you've done speedruns and stuff like that, you'll know of the Krauser fight kind of cheese, where you can basically get him stuck in a knife loop and he can't do anything. It's a small thing, but people are wondering if they'll fix that in the remake, or you just won't be able to do it. It'll definitely be interesting to see if that's the case, because that will really shift up like the whole speedrunning of the game and stuff like that. In terms of the actual fight and the boss fight itself, hopefully it stays mostly intact. I don't think it's over the top. It's actually quite good. You're on a timer. You've got to beat him in a certain amount of time. He is quite difficult if you play on hard difficulty and don't use the knife. So it's a decent fight. And I'm sure, again, with the new systems in the game, how you can free aim now and move around, he'll probably be a bit more aggressive as well. So hopefully that stays mostly the same. And to people who kind of want that glitch, is it a glitch? I don't know if it's a glitch, but that method to stay in the game, maybe it will, maybe it won't, who knows. Just keep in mind, in the Resident Evil 2 remake, there is kind of a method exactly like it with the first stage Birkin fight, where you can literally kill him with a knife way quicker than you can with any bullets. So it is a thing that exists in the remake already, so maybe it will be a thing in Resident Evil 4 as well. One thing I do want to mention briefly is the island section, the final kind of sequence of the game. If you play Resident Evil games before, you'll know that the ending of the game usually ramps up in its combat, and the structure of the horror and the action sections of the game that kind of sit hand in hand throughout the game does disappear, and it's just full on action. It does make sense because it is the end of the game, but I always feel like the last section of the games doesn't ever really feel as good as the rest of it. Just for an example, the factory section and the Chris section for Village is very over the top. Still fun, just very over the top. The boat section in Resident Evil 7, probably one of the weakest ending portions of a game in the series. I'm not a fan of the boat in 7 at all, really. And obviously you've got the boat in Resident Evil 5 and the volcano. Resident Evil 6, the entire game. And, it's just, the structures do shift, especially towards the end of the game in the more horror-focused entries in the series. That being said, the island section in RE4 I'm not a massive fan of anyway, personally. I think it gets quite annoying. It throws a lot of enemies at you very quickly, and it gets kind of tedious, especially again on harder difficulties if you have to go through it, because it's just a nightmare at times. The one part specifically I'm talking about is the bit kinda close to the end, where you've got Mike in a helicopter above you, and there's just loads of enemies coming at you at once. Kind of frustrating, especially on professional, but it's still fun. It's fun, but it's very tedious and very kind of boring on like multiple playthroughs basically. I would imagine, again, the island section of the game is probably going to change. Whether they'll cut parts out or add parts in, I'm not too sure. We'll have to wait and see. But like I said earlier in the video, like the castle section and probably the island section are going to change. I just don't know, to what kind of extreme they'll change it to, if they change it at all. So we'll just have to wait and see for that one. And that's basically going to do it in terms of like the bulkier parts of the game that could change and what we haven't seen of them yet. In terms of anything else, there's a few things. They're a lot smaller, mainly just kind of the inventory system. I know people really like the inventory system from the original 4, and there is a lot of kind of speculation going around that they're going to use the same one from Village, which is still the same, but just not as good. It's not as precise, but we'll see what they do with that. And there's a few other things as well in terms of the combat and the beginning portion of the game as well. There's a few things people are wondering about, but in terms of the main parts I said, I think they'll probably see the most change. But if there's anything, again, do you guys want to see changed in the game, or do you think could change, let me know in the comments below. And then hopefully we can discuss that in the comments, and maybe you guys have different opinions to what I think will change in the game. But that is going to do it. Thank you all for coming by. Remember to subscribe for more Resident Evil content. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all tomorrow.